Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something, well, pretty surprising. Germany. A really wealthy country, right? But their home ownership rate, it's only about 47%.
Yeah, that number really stands out.
Sure.
Especially when you think about, say, the US or the UK, France, Canada. They're all hovering around 65%.
Or even Spain, which is over 75.
Exactly. So Germany is different.
It really is. So the big question for this deep dive, and we're pulling from a really interesting video transcript we looked at, is why? What's actually going on there? What's stopping Germans from buying homes or maybe making renting just, well, a better option?
And that's what we want to unpack. We'll use the material to get into the economics, the social factors, even the history and maybe some cultural stuff behind that 47% figure.
Okay, let's dig in. It's just really expensive to buy property in Germany.
It is. The material confirmed German houses are, among the priciest in Europe, but it's not just the list price.
Right, that's key. The material really highlights these significant extra costs. What are we talking about there?
Okay, so this is where it gets particularly tough for buyers. On top of the property price, you've got these transaction costs. There's a real estate transfer tax. Depends on the state. I think around 5%.
Okay.
Then hefty notary fees for the legal side and maybe a land transfer tax too, say if you buy an apartment.
And these add up.
Oh yeah. The material suggests easily over 10% of the property cost just in these fees and taxes. Gone.
Wow, over 10%. Just like that. That's a huge hit before you even start.
It's a massive upfront hurdle. Psychologically too, I imagine.
Absolutely. And this obviously connects to the challenge of actually saving up that money, particularly for younger people. The material mentioned that too.
Yeah, it did. Think about it. If you're young, unmarried, your income tax could be around 40%.
40%.
Plus mandatory insurance, other deductions. What's left each month for savings? The material describes it as, well, pretty limited.
So building up a deposit just takes forever.
A very, very long time for many. It makes getting onto the property ladder incredibly difficult.
And look, let's say you do manage to save something. Getting the actual loan isn't straightforward either.
Right. This is another major point. German banks, they're pretty conservative with mortgages. They typically don't do 100% financing.
So you need a down payment.
A substantial one, often up to 30% of the property's value.
30%.
Yeah. An example, a place in central Berlin costing, say, 5 crore. You'd need to bring 1.5 crore of your own money to the table up front.
1.5 crore saved up.
Yeah.
That's a huge amount.
It's a massive barrier to entry. It stops a lot of people right there.
Okay, so buying is expensive, taxes are high, saving is hard, and you need a giant down payment. That paints a pretty tough picture for buying. But then the material shifts to the alternative, renting. And it highlights the role of social housing, which seems really significant.
Hugely significant. This is a really critical factor in Germany. A large chunk of the housing stock is social housing.
Meaning the rent is controlled.
Exactly. The rent is capped, often way below market rates.
And the difference is big.
Oh, it's staggering. The material compared, say, a social unit rent of maybe 200, 250 euros a month.
Okay.
To the normal market rent for a similar place, which could easily be 1,000 euros. Or even 2,000 euros in a prime spot like central Berlin.
200 versus 2,000, that's incredible.
It's a completely different world of cost. Makes the social housing incredibly attractive.
And who qualifies for these places?
Generally, households with lower annual incomes. The threshold, like maybe under 30,000 euros a year.
And if you qualify, you can get these long-term deals.
Yes, that's another key point. The contracts are often really long, 15, 20, sometimes even 30 years.
30 years, wow.
And crucially, the rent is fixed for that entire period. It doesn't go up.
Fixed for 30 years at that super low rate.
That's the deal in many cases, yeah.
Plus, Germany is known for strong tenant rights, right?
Extremely strong. The material emphasized this. Evicting a tenant is very, very difficult for landlords.
So the contracts really protect the renter.
They absolutely do. It's designed to prevent homelessness. Even if someone falls behind on rent, the legal process to get them out is long and complex.
Okay, let's just put that together. You could potentially live in a decent apartment, maybe even centrally located, pay maybe 200 euros a month, have a contract for decades with no rent increases, and be really hard to evict.
That's the reality for a significant number of people.
Compared to scraping together 1.5 crore for a down payment and taking on massive debt.
Exactly. You can see why the incentive to buy is just much lower for many people, especially those who qualify for social housing. or even just benefit from the generally strong rental protections.
It offers stability and affordability without the huge financial risk. And the landlord handles maintenance.
Right. So why take on the debt and the hassle? Renting looks pretty good.
Okay, that makes a lot of practical sense. So the economics push against buying, and the rental market, especially social housing, pulls towards renting. But the material we looked at also went deeper into history and even psychology.
Yeah, this part was fascinating. It really connects the present situation to Germany's past. Think about post-World War II. Massive destruction. Germany had a huge housing shortage,
How bad was it?
starting with a shortage of about 2.25 million homes, and that number grew to 5.5 million by 1949.
5.5 million families needing homes.
Exactly. The government's absolute priority was just building shelter, quickly.
And buying wasn't really an option for people then.
Not at all. Most people had lost everything. They had no money. And the banks weren't in a position to lend much either.
So the solution had to be building rentals.
It had to be. Build rental properties fast. This massive post-war push for rental housing, it just became normal. Renting wasn't just a temporary fix. It got embedded in the culture as the standard, reliable way to live.
So that experience kind of shapes the national mindset about housing. Renting became the default.
That seems to be the argument, yes. It became the expected path.
And then there was that really interesting point about language. The word Schulden.
Ah, yes. Really thought-provoking.
It has a double meaning, right?
It does. In German, Schulden means both debt and it also means guilt.
Debt and guilt. The same word. That
Yeah.
it feels significant somehow.
It really does. And the material proposed that this linguistic link might reflect, or maybe even reinforce, a kind of cultural tendency in Germany to be wary of debt, to maybe view taking on debt not just as a financial thing, but as something inherently negative, almost like a moral burden, a guilt.
I see. So if you associate debt with guilt, even subconsciously.
Then taking out a huge mortgage, probably the biggest debt most people ever consider, becomes psychologically less appealing.
So this cultural attitude, maybe tied to the language, reinforces the preference for renting that was already established by history and economics.
Precisely. It adds another layer to understanding why buying isn't the default aspiration it might be elsewhere. It all kind of fits together.
Wow. Okay, so it's really not just one thing. It's this complex mix. You've got the high economic hurdles to buying the costs, the fees, the down payments.
Yep, combined with a really strong, secure rental market, especially with that social housing safety net making renting super affordable and stable for many.
And then add the historical context, that post-war reality where renting had to be the solution, and it just stuck.
And finally, this potential cultural perspective on debt itself, maybe hinted at by language, making people less inclined to borrow huge sums for a house.
It's fascinating how all these threads, economic, social, historical, cultural, weave together to create this distinct picture in Germany, explaining that lower homeownership rate.
It really is, and this deep dive, based on the material we examined, shows how complex these societal patterns can be.
It definitely makes you think, doesn't it? About how a country's unique history, its policies, its economic conditions, maybe even its language, can shape something as fundamental as where and how its people live.
Absolutely. It challenges assumptions about homeownership being the universal goal.
And it leaves you wondering, what are the pros and cons, maybe, for society as a whole when you have such a strong rental sector like Germany's compared to places obsessed with owning?
That's a great question. And how does that idea of Schulden, that potential aversion to debt, play out in other areas of German life beyond just houses? Something interesting to ponder.